The desk is an absolute mess because we've been using the card that we're reviewing today in an overclocking competition with Jay and with Paul from Paul's Hardware. And you can check that content out separately. But before we got into any of the overclocking and the mods that we're working on coming up, like shunt resistor mods soldered onto the card, we ran all the normal review numbers so that we could produce this look at the EVGA RTX 3090 FTW3. There is not technically an MSRP that we've received yet, and because this card is impossible to find anywhere on retail sites, we're not 100% sure what it's supposed to cost. But we have some ideas, and we'll talk through today the value of the already strained 3090 GPUs when applied to a higher-end partner model. Before that, this video is brought to you by EK and the EK AIO series. We recently reviewed the EK AIO DRGB 360 as one of the top performers in our CPU cooler charts, advantaged from its fan performance and high-quality pump internals that we found during our teardown. If you're looking for a high-performance RGB CPU cooler with longer steady-state times, check out the EK AIO 360 and 240 at the links in the description below. So as a reminder, with partner models of any video card, what you're really looking for is quality of life improvements. And when we say that, what we really mean is things like noise-normalized thermals. So who has the most efficient cooler? When you set them to the same noise level, not the same type of noise necessarily, but same noise volume, who has the best thermal result, who's got the highest sustained clocks as a result of the GPU boosting behavior, where it's contingent upon thermals, the extent to which it boosts. And then you're also looking at stuff like fan spin down. Some of the older reference designs didn't have that, but partner models did. Now it's pretty much everywhere. Things like the thermistors that EVGA places on its cards. So the FTW3 cards have ICX thermistors. Those are NTC thermistors, so it's like a smaller thermocouple basically. It's placed in a few spots on the board and you can get a temperature measurement out of it. These are not particularly actionable. It's an extremely nice marketing point, but there are a few places where they are useful. So we find them useful for more extreme overclocking, even for water-cooled overclocking, like putting the board under a water block, which it's difficult to find for something like an FTW3, but they are coming out. But the reason it's useful there is because you can just sort of mentally verify that you do have good contact to the memory, to the MOSFETs, things like that. You don't have to really wonder about it and worry if you're burning something up. So for extreme overclocking, it's useful because when we're trying to figure out, do we need to run a memory heater, or is the memory running too hot without direct contact cooling, we can look at those thermistor numbers and figure out, okay, well, we're not really anywhere close to the 110 degree TJ max, so we're fine. So that's kind of what they're useful for. Daily life, using it out of the box, no modifications, not much overclocking to speak of. The thermistors, the 9 thermal sensors on the board, are not really that useful. But again, we like them for other features outside of the stock usage. So keep that in mind. It might be useful to you, it might be utterly useless, but something kind of neat to look at. And that's kind of about the end of it. As for the rest of the card, it looks like this will probably be in the range of $1,800. We haven't gotten official confirmation if we get it before this video goes up, but after it's edited, we'll put it right here on the screen. But we're reviewing this under the assumption that it's about $1,800, and I'll give you some alternative prices and where I think it stands towards the end of the video. We don't expect many people will be buying 3090s, but for those who are, it'll be useful to look at how the partner models compare to the comparatively overbuilt versus previous generations 3090 Founders Edition. So this will give you a good look versus the FE card. It is the first 3090 partner model reviewing. Don't know if we're going to review more, but in the very least, you get a look versus FE and where it lands. So without further delay, let's get into the thermal numbers, acoustics, and gaming performance, frequency behavior, overclocking behavior, all that stuff. And then if you want additional information on how our testing is conducted, you can check out our GPU testing methodology piece, which we'll link in the description below. Let's get into it. Power testing's up first, looking at averages, and then we'll look at more depth in a moment. The RTX 3090 FE ran 356 watts in a full load of FurMark. Overclocking the FE got it to 408 watts, making one of the least efficient gains we've seen in a long time. And contrary to NVIDIA's claims that you can clock this up somewhat efficiently. The FTW3 starts higher at 384 to 391 watts and runs up to 464 watts with the fully unlocked shipping vBIOS. We'd still like more power available for serious overclocking though. The normal vBIOS, as it's called, lands at 385 to 390 watts. So there's basically zero change from the so-called OCV BIOS. We'd also expect minimal changes in gaming benchmarks, so this should theoretically mostly impact fan speeds based on what we're seeing here. If you're curious, a gaming workload reflects similar behaviors. Total War 3 Kingdoms at 4K Ultra lines up almost exactly the same way, with everything in the range of 400 watts before any overclocking. Looking at the per rail power draw, we observed the PCIe cables at about 160 watts, 135 watts, and 115 watts. The PCIe slot draws a little bit over the official PCI SIG spec in this initial testing and hits 80 watts somewhat consistently. It should be closer to 75 watts max. This isn't much of a concern, but if you were to run multiple of these anyway, say 3 in a water-cooled config for multi-GPU processing, you'll definitely want an auxiliary power into the motherboard to take some of the load off of the 24-pin cable and prevent any melting. Keep in mind that you can't SLI 3 of them, but you can still run 3+ of them without a bridge for workstation applications where it might not really benefit from a bridge. The power is just high on the slot overall, and considering the 12-volt cables still have plenty of room, if possible, it makes sense to try and shift the load there. We have a lot of thermals to cover, but we'll start with the fan response to temperature under auto settings and as controlled purely by VBIOS. This is the out-of-the-box noise test. In this testing, the RTX 3090 Fe ramps slowly over a 5-minute period to about 37 dBA, and is more variable in its fan ramp over time. The slower ramp period is the nature of having so much surface area and metal, and it takes longer to reach steady state and soak as a result. The FTW3 ramps faster, kicking fans into gear sooner and also ramping faster. The 3090 FTW3 levels out at about 39 dBA at a 20-inch distance when fully auto. That marks its auto fan speeds as a bit louder than the 3090 FE, just within territory of being noticeable. But that doesn't mean its cooler is any worse or any better. We need to look at noise-normalized thermals to determine the efficiency of each cooler. Before, though, we move into noise-normalized thermal testing, let's map the RPM to the noise that we just saw. GPU temperature target on the FE card, using a Firestrike looping render, landed at about 68 degrees Celsius. The EVGA 3090 FTW3 hit 65 under automatic VBIOS configurations, and note that again this is with the ambient controlled and monitored every second of the test at about 21 degrees Celsius. This is not a delta T measurement, it's just the temperature. The fan RPM for the cards is not directly comparable either because the fan count and the placement is different. However, the EVGA card spun up to about 1900 RPM once at steady state. Thermals become tricky when normalized for noise anyway. We equalize the fan noise levels so the cards produce the same noise, but they aren't producing the same work. The power is not normalized, as we saw previously, and the extra 40 watts allowed on the EVGA 3090 FTW3 means that even a noise-normalized test is not truly a test of purely the coolers. The 3090 FTW3 therefore has a limitation, but we can still evaluate it with another metric. The RTX 3090 FE cooler maintained about a 10-degree advantage at 40 dBA, with a 57 degrees Celsius baseline versus about a 67-degree result for the GPU only on the FTW3. From this line plot alone, the FE looks better, and we can see how you would think that. However, if we look at the watts per degree Celsius dissipated, the EVGA FTW3 runs 5.8 watts per degree Celsius, while the FE cooler runs 6.4. The EVGA cooler is technically coping better when proportionately aligned for the power load, but the FE GPU cooler is undoubtedly extremely competitive here and running cooler when considering its lower power target. This next plot is one of memory thermals, as measured at 40 dBA. For starters, we'll look at the NTC thermistors included on the EVGA ICX board, and then we'll look at manually placed thermocouples. These NTC thermistors are placed adjacent to some memory modules, and we'll show the image of that now. And if you're curious to learn more about these, you can learn about it in our original review of the ICX cards back when they launched in the 10 series. These 3 NTC thermistors plotted around the same temperature across the modules, which is good. There's even cooling across the memory, so the load is evenly distributed. The result was about 70 degrees Celsius for all 3 measurements. There was one erroneous spike at around the 510 second mark. The spike was to 6,543 degrees Celsius and is obviously incorrect. The Precision PX1 software bugged out somewhere in the process of reading the thermistors because, to our knowledge, our lab did not, in fact, exceed the temperature of the sun during testing. Thus far, the memory temperatures are well within spec, even accounting for the delta between the inside and outside of the memory casing. TJ max is 110 degrees. So 70 to 80 is a good place to be. To verify the accuracy of these sensors and the software, other than that bug, we attached our own thermocouples to a hotspot top memory module and a memory module near the slot, which often runs warmer because of its presence near the motherboard. For this chart, we averaged the ICX thermistors to clean up the charts. The average is just below 70 degrees. Our bottom GDDR6X module measured about 66 degrees Celsius, as tested on the back of the PCB where the flip chip package is closer to the thermocouple as opposed to through the casing. The top module measured about 73 degrees Celsius. Averaged, they come out to 70, so it's nearly identical to the ICX results. This is great news for two reasons. First, the ICX sensors appear accurate, but there is no electrical reason they wouldn't be, so this isn't really a surprise unless EVGA were doing something screwy in software. Thermistors aren't an EVGA invention. They're extremely common. It'd be hard to screw them up, although it is possible. Secondly, the more important one is that it means our own testing is accurate. So even without the interior junction temperature being exposed to us via software, we can still produce numbers that are reliable in testing. A delta of maybe about 5 to 10 degrees Celsius could safely be added for junction internal temperature. This chart is from the same data, but for the power components. This includes 5 power measurements from ICX and 1 from our own VRM MOSFET thermocouple. We placed this on the exact center thermocouple, and we determined which one would be hottest by taking some thermography. We'll plot these line by line since it's kind of messy. The power measurements heat up to low 60s at best, with the bulk of them in the range of 65 to 70 degrees, and the worst measurement at about 78 degrees Celsius. Our own VRM MOSFET measurement plots last and is a much more stable line, thanks to the placement being less sensitive. And it also plots right in the middle of the pack. Once again, we're mostly internally excited that our own measurements are proving useful here. It doesn't really say anything about the card in terms of its usefulness or its quality, but we're just happy to see that the numbers we're producing are good. All of these measurements are well within spec for the components on EVGA's side, and again, as a reminder, this is 40 dBA normalized, although Auto was running pretty close to this mark anyway. We next need to determine the frequency of the cards to evaluate out-of-the-box performance. Plotted in a frozen frame render in 3D Mark, the 3090 FE card, shown in blue, averaged in the range of 1890 to 1905 MHz. The EVGA FTW3 OCV BIOS flattened out around 1935 MHz, so it's holding about 30 MHz higher than the stock FE. Some of this comes from the boosted stock power consumption. The normal VBIOS, for whatever that means, plots right between them, although it makes this chart completely illegible. It rides in the middle and is not significantly different from either. We're not really sure that EVGA meant to do it this way. It seems kind of like a screw up in the VBIOS programming, but they're mostly the same as each other. As we get into games, just a reminder that we're keeping a truncated list of games for partner models. That's because the performance doesn't change much card to card. So if you want the full scope of the 3090 performance, we'd recommend checking our initial 3090 review, which also has 8K benchmarks. For partner cards, the focus is mostly on thermals. It's also on noise and overclocking, but we'll give some basics for games here anyway. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the EVGA RTX 3090 FTW3 plotted a 106 FPS average for the OCV BIOS and didn't really change much for Silent. It ended up about 1.3% ahead of the stock 3090 FE. Overclocking got us to 111 FPS average, and that's with a lighter OC. We could hold 1200 MHz memory and plus 80 MHz core offset for both of those in competitive overclocking, but it was tough to keep that stable in all games. This config we're showing was stable though. The uplift from the OC is 5.2% in average FPS. In Red Dead 2 with DX12, the EVGA 3090 FTW3 plotted at 92.5 FPS average for the OCV BIOS, or 91.2 for the Silent VBIOS, or normal as they call it. The results flank the RTX 3090 Founders Edition. The SLI results, as a reminder, don't improve here because the DX12 version of this game doesn't support SLI. Vulkan does, but that's in a previous video if you care about SLI. There's basically no difference here overall between the FTW3 and the FE, and overclocking the 3090 FTW3 gets it to 101 FPS average, which is an improvement that's noteworthy of about 9% over the stock FTW3, and that's actually very good. And we also found that changing the memory tune here benefited the card significantly. So perhaps Red Dead 2, at least with DX12, is maybe a little bit more sensitive to the memory increases than to core increases, although we haven't fully validated this. That's kind of our takeaway from the initial data so far. Overall, though, it's worth overclocking these cards sometimes in single card configurations. We'll skip 1440p because it was CPU bound. Rainbow Six Siege at 4K has the FTW3 about 4.4% ahead of the 3090 FE card. That's a bigger difference than we've seen elsewhere, but the FPS range is also wider, and so differences become less significant. Overclocking got us to 218 FPS average, and that's a gain of about 2.4%. So depending on how you dice the numbers up, it's either not too exciting or we'll move on. In Hitman 2, the RTX 3090 FTW3 ran 114 FPS average for the OC VBIOS, a 4.3% gain over the stock FE card. The normal VBIOS, like in Rainbow Six, is technically below the OC VBIOS score. That's expected, but it maintains a rank above the 3090 FE single card. SLI doesn't do anything here. Once again, you'd have to look at our previous testing for more of that. And as for the overclocked 3090 FTW3, that one ran 116 FPS average, a gain of 2.2% over the stock OC VBIOS. Not particularly worth it in this one, unfortunately. So conclusions then. Well, if it's $1,500 and you're definitely buying a 3090 anyway, then it's worth it in a sense. The FE card is actually cooled well enough that it's not like the previous reference series designs where we would say buy literally anything except for the reference design and a blower card. Like anything else would be an upgrade for the most part. But in this case, the FE card for the 3090 is actually comparatively very, very good. It's competitive. Now, the EVGA card was pulling about 40 watts higher and because of its VBIOS increase. That's generally regarded as a good thing if you're not really familiar with it, because it gives you a higher power target. So for things like overclocking or for just native stock boosting, you're going to boost higher. And it does. It boosts in the range of maybe 15 to 30 megahertz higher, depending on when you take the measurement and in what application. The extent to which that is useful is obviously limited. It's not like that number is going to get you a ton for stock versus stock performance. It is technically better. A lot of people buy for the best. This isn't necessarily that, but it's going to get you pretty close without getting into class of, say, Kingpin card territory if we're also talking EVGA, or Hall of Fame territory from Galaxy, something like that. So the FTW3, if it were price equivalent with the FE, we would probably recommend over the FE for a few reasons, but one of them is that it does have technically superior noise-normalized performance, particularly when you're looking at the power consumption. So if you were to power normalize it, even better. But it's also more likely for the FTW3 you'll be able to at some point find an unlocked VBIOS on a forum somewhere if you're into the overclocking scene. If you're more of a Blender, 3D artist type of user, game engine user, it's technically better in some aspects. It's just that the extent to which it's better feels a lot more limited than past generations. The card's smaller than the FE, so that's a potential upside, but it's weird right now to stand here and say that an FE or a reference card is not utter garbage. That has never really been the case, at least not for a long time. Radeon 7 was okay, but this is much different. So that's kind of where they stand relative to each other. $1,800 or whatever, plus or minus $100, it doesn't really matter at this point. At $1,800 or $1,700 or $1,900, it is really hard to justify unless you're specifically interested in the overclocking stuff. If you're a professional user, you're probably interested in things like the memory capacity. You might need to buy two of the same partner model if you can't get two FEs and you want to run an SLI bridge, because keep in mind, the FE bridge, it's the bridge placement, the SLI fingers are not standardized. That was true last gen too, and generations before that. But because they're not standardized, don't expect to buy an FE card with an FTW3 because you're not going to be able to do it. Not in a case anyway. On an open bench where you can freely position the cards on the x-axis, sure. But that is a limitation to consider. You'll have to buy two of some card if you want to use SLI to make it easiest. So for pure overclocking, it is worthwhile in that aspect. It's a little upsetting how limiting the VBIOS is from a power perspective. We'd like to see maybe 50 more watts at least out of it. More load balancing between the PCIe slot and the cables would be great too, if possible. But the definitely power limited shunt resistor mods can fix that. It's not particularly fun to do this generation. There's a lot more shunts on the cards. That's an NVIDIA level thing, not just EVGA, but it applies to them too. And of course, other than all of this is all under the assumption that you are buying a 3090 because you know for your use case, it is actually genuinely very useful. They exist. 3D artists, again, our own Andrew Coleman, who works for GN, does a lot of 3D art. And for him, he wants a 3090 because he works with scenes that are very high in memory requirements on the video card, and he doesn't care about the Titan RTX features or the higher end driver features that were turned off this time. So if you're like Andrew and you need that kind of card, then, well, here's your review. But otherwise, if you're just thinking 3090 for gaming in general, check our original 3090 review, and that'll give you a good idea of what we think about that. Generally not worth it, but there are people who just want the best, to use the common quote we see. And that's not something we'd entirely fault, but we would encourage at least researching it a bit and seeing if maybe the best might be something cheaper and then putting the delta of money towards something else. Unless you're Jeff Bezos, in which case, well, I don't know why you're watching our stuff, but I'd appreciate a free Prime membership. Thanks for watching. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.